Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of LGBTQIA+, Heroes, Icons, Legends, and Events. This series of programs covers a wide variety of topics such as astronaut Sally Ride, politician Harvey Milk, and entertainers Freddie Mercury, RuPaul, and Laverne Cox. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the most famous and popular spokesman for the American civil rights movement. Other prominent civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks, Andrew Young, and John Lewis worked alongside Dr. King, and they became famous in their own right. But one very important civil rights activist is not nearly as well known. Today we'll talk about a man who was the most influential organizer of nonviolent protest between 1941 and 1965, and who also led movements for socialism and gay rights. He counseled Dr. King, planned the March on Washington, and played a major role in the American civil rights movement. Today we'll talk about Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was born on March 17, 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, to Florence Rustin and Archie Hopkins. He was raised by his maternal grandparents, Julia and Jennifer Rustin, as one of their 12 children. His grandparents were well-to-do caterers. Julia was a Quaker and a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Activists W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson were frequent visitors to the Rustin home. As a teenager, Bayard was inspired by these activists to campaign against the racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws, which were state and local laws enforcing segregation. Bayard recognized his sexual orientation when he was a teenager. He told his grandmother Julia that he preferred to spend time with males instead of females. She replied, "I suppose that's what you need to do." In 1932, Bayard began attending Wilberforce University, a historically black college in Ohio. He was active in many campus organizations. He was expelled in 1936 for organizing a strike against the low quality of food being served in the cafeteria. He then attended Cheyney State Teachers College in Pennsylvania. He moved to Harlem in 1937 and began studies at City College of New York. Not long after moving to New York City, he joined the 15th Street meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, a Quaker group. He was also active in the Communist Party USA. Bayard joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1941 as a race relations secretary. He and his fellow activists protested racial segregation in the armed forces, and they planned to march in Washington. They met with President Franklin Roosevelt and promised to cancel their march if desegregation could be achieved. President Roosevelt issued an executive order, the Fair Employment Act, which banned discrimination in the armed forces and federal agencies. The Fellowship of Reconciliation March was canceled, but unfortunately the armed forces were not desegregated until 1948 under President Harry S. Truman. In 1942, on a bus ride through the southeastern United States from Louisville, Kentucky to Nashville, Tennessee, Bayard took a seat in the second row instead of in the back of the bus, as expected with Jim Crow laws. The bus driver asked him repeatedly to move to the back of the bus, but he refused, saying that, quote, "My conscience would not allow me to obey an unjust law." The bus driver called the police, and just north of Nashville, 4 police officers got on the bus to confront Bayard. He was beaten and kicked by the police officers, but he didn't fight back. He was arrested and taken to jail. One of the white travelers on the bus went to the jail to seek his release. After being interrogated, he was released and not charged with the crime. He spoke later in an interview about his decision to disobey and get arrested. He said that he did get up to move to the back of the bus, and as he walked down the aisle, a young boy grabbed at his red necktie. The child's mother slapped the boy and told him not to touch a black man, although she used a racially derogatory term. Bayard was shocked by the woman's racist language since he had never experienced such racism in the North. So he decided to move to the front of the bus. In the interview, he said, quote, "I owe it to that child, not only to my own dignity, I owe it to that child that it should be educated to know that blacks do not want to sit in the back, and therefore I should get arrested, letting all of these white people in the bus know that I do not accept that." In 1942, during World War II, Bayard and 2 other Fellowship of Reconciliation staff members formed the Congress of Racial Equity, or CORE, with activist Bernice Fisher. It was developed as a pacifist group based on the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, who used nonviolent resistance in India to fight British rule. The members of CORE refused to register for the draft and eventually were convicted of violating the Selective Service Act. Bayard served his time from 1944 to 1946 in the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. During his imprisonment, he organized protests against the segregated dining room. After being released in 1946, he was arrested several times for protesting against British colonial rule in India and Africa. He spent 22 days on a chain gang in North Carolina and published an article after his release that led to reforms of prison chain gangs. In 1948, Bayard traveled to India to learn more about nonviolent protests and resistance. His peaceful protest mentor Mahatma Gandhi had been assassinated earlier that year, but Bayard spent 7 weeks learning about Gandhi's principles of nonviolent protest. He also traveled to Africa to meet with the leaders of independence movements in Nigeria and Ghana. Bayard was arrested in January 1953 for sexual activity in a car with 2 young men. He pleaded guilty to sex perversion, as sodomy was referred to at that time, and was sentenced to 60 days in jail. It was the first time that he was identified publicly as a homosexual. He resigned or possibly was fired from the Fellowship of Reconciliation because of his conviction. In 1953, Bayard became the executive secretary of the War Resisters League. He took leave from that post in 1956 to advise Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the tactics of nonviolent protest. Dr. King was busy organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. Bayard later said that Dr. King had no concept of nonviolent tactics since he had armed guards and personal weapons in his home to protect his family. Bayard convinced him to get rid of his guns and security team. In 1957, Bayard and Dr. King started organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Several African American leaders were worried that Bayard's sexual orientation and past membership in the Communist Party USA would affect the civil rights movement. Bayard became a part of the planning committee for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1962 at the invitation of A. Philip Randolph. The march was planned to be a centennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862. Bayard was very involved in the organization of the march. He hired off-duty police officers and bus drivers to manage the crowds and direct traffic. He also scheduled the people who would speak at the podium. He had Dr. King's support, but the leaders of the NAACP feared that Bayard's prior legal issues would adversely affect their efforts. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was scheduled for August 28, 1963. Bayard and his co-planners had no idea how many people would attend. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the march, only a few hundred people had gathered. By 9:30 that morning, 40,000 marchers had assembled at the Washington Monument. A few hours later, the crowd had grown to over 250,000 people. At the Lincoln Memorial, famous singers and Hollywood celebrities entertained the crowd. The march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial started at noon. The program at the Lincoln Memorial was scheduled for 2 p.m. Opera singer Marian Anderson sang the national anthem, and A. Philip Randolph delivered the first speech. Other activists, such as John Lewis, also spoke. Dr. King was scheduled to speak last. As Bayard stood proudly behind him, Dr. King gave his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Afterward, Bayard took his place at the podium to read the demands of the march. The primary demands were desegregation of schools, economic justice for housing, education, and jobs, and protection of the right to vote. Bayard had never spoken to such a large group of people. He certainly had never had such a prominent public role. The March on Washington was the largest and most successful nonviolent demonstration in the history of the civil rights movement and in the history of the United States. President John F. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act in 1963. After his assassination in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was determined to pass the civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. The leaders of the NAACP didn't want Bayard to get any recognition for his work in organizing the march because of his sexual orientation and legal issues. However, Bayard became more well-known and was recognized for his work after a photo appeared on the cover of Life magazine of him and one of the other prominent organizers of the march, A. Philip Randolph. Bayard continued his work in the civil rights movement. He participated in the Freedom Riders protests. He also became active in politics and foreign policy. He advocated for labor unions, social democracy, and desegregation of schools. He also fought for the rights of Soviet Jews who faced the same discrimination in the Soviet Union that blacks faced in the United States. Bayard met Walter Nagel, an art student and photographer, in April 1977 in New York City. Walter recalled the moment they met, saying, quote, "The day that I met Bayard, I was actually on my way to Times Square. We were on the same corner waiting for the light to change. He had a wonderful shock of white hair. I guess he was of my parents' generation, but we looked at each other and lightning struck." After a few months, they moved in together. Since same-sex marriage was not legal at the time, Bayard adopted Walter as his son in 1982 to ensure that their relationship was legally protected. They stayed together until Bayard's death. Walter encouraged Bayard to engage in the gay rights movements in the 1980s. Bayard Rustin died on August 24, 1987, while on a humanitarian mission in Haiti. In 2012, he was inducted into the Legacy Walk in Chicago, an outdoor installation honoring LGBTQ people in history. He was praised after his death by President Ronald Reagan. Bayard was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama on November 20, 2013, for his work on the March on Washington. His partner, Walter Nagel, accepted the award. During the same awards ceremony, astronaut Sally Ride's partner, Dr. Tam O'Shaughnessy, accepted the Medal of Freedom Award for Sally. Together, Dr. O'Shaughnessy and Walter Nagel were the first LGBT people to accept the Presidential Medal of Freedom on behalf of their same-sex partners. After accepting the award, Walter spoke of Bayard, saying, quote, "Being black, being homosexual, being a political radical, that's a combination that's pretty volatile, and it comes along like Halley's Comet. Bayard's life was complex, but at the same time, I think it makes it a lot more interesting." Bayard was honored in 2013 as an inductee in the United States Department of Labor Hall of Honor. In 2014, he was one of the inaugural honorees of the Rainbow Honor Walk in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood. The Rainbow Honor Walk honors LGBTQ people who have made significant contributions to society through their lives and achievements. Several schools are named for him. In June 2019, Bayard was one of 50 American heroes honored on the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor in New York City's Stonewall Inn. He was posthumously pardoned for his 1953 sexual perversion conviction in 2020 by California Governor Gavin Newsom. To know more about Bayard Rustin, go to our website, gwinnettpl.org, and check out the following suggested items: Leaders Like Us, Bayard Rustin, by J.P. Miller; Boy, Oh Boy, by Cliff Leake; The Cambridge Guide to African American History by Raymond Gabbins; Queer There and Everywhere by Sarah Prager; and Troublemaker for Justice, The Story of Bayard Rustin, the Man Behind the March on Washington, by Jacqueline Houtman, Walter Nagel, and Michael G. Long. Also, visit our website's digital resources to discover Canopy, our streaming service. Canopy has a wide selection of films and documentaries about LGBTQIA+ topics. Thank you for watching.